Welcome to the Business Analysis Knowledge Share. In this episode, I talk about prioritizing requirements, which is task number 3 in the Requirements Lifecycle Management, Chapter 5 of the BABOK. Without further ado, let's get started. Now, why do we prioritize requirements? The purpose of prioritizing requirements is to rank the requirements in the order of relative importance. Prioritization is the act of ranking requirements to determine their relative importance to stakeholders. When a requirement is prioritized, it is given greater or lesser priority. Priority can refer to the relative value of a requirement or to the sequence in which it will be implemented. Prioritization is an ongoing process, with priorities changing in the context as the context changes. Interdependencies between requirements are identified and may be used as a basis for prioritization. Prioritization is a critical exercise that seeks to ensure the maximum value is achieved. Now, be it in Agile or within SDLC frameworks, prioritization is an important task that needs to be kept in the forefront of a BA's mind or a person that has a skill set of business analysis. The elements of prioritization of requirements are the benefit. So the basis of prioritization, which is basically the benefit. So what sort of benefit is it bringing to the stakeholders? So you got to think about benefit equals value. Penalty, negative consequences. Are there any sort of government regulations, or are there any sort of negative impacts that would that need to be taken into consideration to implement a requirement or a change? Cost, you got to look at expense. Could changes or could this expense factor guide stakeholders to prioritize requirements? Risk, is there a higher priority risk that needs to be implemented first? So many a times prototyping is done in order to understand if a requirement that is at a high risk is able to be produced. So they kind of narrow it down with a prototype. And a prototype is basically more like a model, building a model of the product. Dependencies, understanding the relationships between requirements. So say, for instance, you have a requirement A that is being implemented, has been prioritized, but then comes along a requirement F. And a requirement F needs to be implemented with requirement A because they both go hand in hand. So in that case, requirement F would be prioritized above the rest of the requirements. Time sensitivity. So the best before date. Example, implementing requirements before, say, for instance, competitor is putting the product in at a certain time. So you want to implement your product before that. Stability. How stable is that requirement? Meaning, how is that requirement going to change in the next 2 or 3 months before the product is even delivered? So you got to consider that. Regulation or policy compliance, meaning what sorts of government regulations are being impacted by this requirements implementation. So there's a couple of factors you got to consider when prioritizing. One is the benefit, the penalty, any sort of negative penalties, costs, risks, dependencies, time sensitivity, stability, regulation and policy compliance. The second one is challenges of prioritization, which is stakeholder disagreement and inability to assign lower priority. So if you have stakeholders from different departments, they could very well have different opinions on what should be of higher priority. Finance may have a higher priority for a specific requirement, whereas operations may not consider that as higher priority. So it's really a juggling game. Inability to assign lower priority. So many times stakeholders keep saying, well, this is high priority, this is medium priority, but they never get down to the low priorities because most of the times they're concerned that low priority they won't be able to implement the low priority. That'll never be done. Continual prioritization. So you need to consider the relative value first and then reprioritize. So always prioritize requirements continuously on an ongoing basis. Within Agile, that is not a problem because you are continuously prioritizing building in sprints versus an SDLC where it's a little more rigid and prioritization doesn't come in continuously, but it comes in the form of change requests, which is then kind of looked through a governance body, and then it's approved or declined. Guidelines and tools for prioritization. There's business constraints, change strategy that's got to be considered, understanding of the domain, the governance approach, and how are you going to approach these changes, requirements architecture, meaning how is this going to be structured in terms of requirements, and how are you going to introduce change into this requirements architecture, requirements management tools and repositories such as Confluence and other tools that are being used, and how to maintain requirements, rather where to maintain those requirements, and solution scope. So you're constantly looking at the solution that has scope that has been laid out initially to understand how does the change that's coming through map back to the scope that was originally carved. There are a couple of techniques used to prioritize requirements. You have the backlog management, then you have business cases. So business cases are typically written upfront, so it's always good to refer to those business cases. Decision analysis, well, how are you going to go about making decisions, and how are you kind of structure that decisioning process? Estimation, estimating costs and benefits. Financial analysis, understanding the numbers behind introducing a change and how that impacts the overall picture. Interview, meaning you can interview stakeholders or other sort of resources to understand, well, if you bring a change in, how is that going to impact, say, for instance, the operations team? Item tracking, used basically to track changes and what the statuses are. Prioritization, that's a technique. You prioritize as different techniques used in prioritization so that all these stakeholders come on the same page. We have risk analysis and management, important tool to understand, well, if you're implementing this, what are the risks associated with implementing this new requirement, and workshops in general to understand as a group, what does this requirement mean? How do you go about merging it with the existing product? So that's an important tool. In terms of the users or stakeholders, you want to engage are the implementation SMEs, your project manager, your regulator, your sponsor, your customer, and your end user. Let's look at the case study. Now, Amanda, as we mentioned in our previous videos, is working on a project to move a website to an online restaurant. Now, Amanda has the requirements and the design, that's her input. She's looking to prioritize any incoming requirements. She is using her backlog and intake process as a starting point. In order to prioritize the requirements, she needs to understand their relative importance to the stakeholders. Because she's working with multiple departments like finance and operations, she needs to understand the interdependencies among the requirements. She schedules a weekly prioritization meeting with her stakeholders and prioritizes the requirements based on the benefit cost, whether there are any consequences for not implementing the effort. She also considers the risk, the dependencies, whether the online delivery needs to be immediate versus later, the stability of the requirements as well. During the prioritization sessions, she realizes that the stakeholders from finance and operations do not agree with the prioritization of everything or they consider everything is important. She employs a process that helps the stakeholders get beyond the arguments. In the weekly prioritization sessions, she prioritizes the efforts with the stakeholders continuously. She also researches any business constraints using her domain knowledge, applies governance approach and change strategy, as well as the requirements architecture to understand the relationship with other requirements. She leverages Confluence for documentation and references the original scope document. She uses a bunch of techniques, as mentioned earlier, to prioritize these requirements, and they're listed here. She can't prioritize requirements by herself, so she works with Ben, who is her customer, domain subject matter expert, and end user. She works with Sean, who is a sponsor, the solution architect, who is implementation SME, the project manager, Tim, and the health regulator. Well, thank you so much for listening to prioritization of requirements, and please do consider subscribing to this channel, as well as review our or go to our website, beknowledgeshare.com. Thank you so much.